Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on sesame. This is the beginning of a running series brought to you by the Crop History Consortium. As founder of the Crop History Consortium, or CHC for short, it's a pleasure to kick off this series, which is one of our flagship projects. The CHC was founded at a seed meeting of the French Embassy in London in 2022, aiming to facilitate interdisciplinary integration and synthesis of historical crop diffusion in the Middle East and Mediterranean. Our aim is to bring together archaeobotanists and other archaeological scientists, historians and ethnobotanists to produce multidisciplinary collaborative research and syntheses. The CHC recently became an official community of the European Archaeology Association and a research group of the International Workgroup for Paleoethnobotany. In addition to this webinar series, our activities include joint publications, workshops, conference sessions, and, in the near future, a series of interactive maps charting crop diffusion. These activities are currently funded by a UKRI Arts and Humanities Research Council networking grant awarded to Michelle Alexander and me. Many people deserve thanks for making this webinar possible. Michelle's leadership has been instrumental in advancing CHC activities. Vladimir Dabrowski is the series' main organizer, with valuable input from Rachele Pierini and Raya Evan-David. I'd also like to thank our speakers, Walther Sallaberger and Carolyne Douché, as well as our discussant, Margareta Tengberg, and our moderator, Sureshkumar Muthukumaran, who have generously agreed to take on these important roles. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to pass it over to Suresh to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Daniel. I am delighted to welcome you once again to the first ever webinar of the Crop History Consortium's webinar series. We have a wonderful lineup of speakers and a discussant today. The focus of the present session is sesame, Sesamum indicum, a native of the Indian subcontinent that traveled far afield as early as the Bronze Age. Our speakers and discussant will examine the spread and cultivation of sesame in the Middle East Mediterranean region with a particular focus on Mesopotamia. We will have a Q&A session after our speakers and discussant have spoken, so please write down your questions as our speakers go through their material, and feel free to drop them in the chat box when we open the Q&A session. Let me introduce, without further ado, our first speaker, Dr. Carolyne Douché. Dr. Carolyne Douché is an archaeobotanist who completed her PhD in archaeology at Université Paris 11 Panthéon-Sorbonne in collaboration with the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris. Her doctoral research was jointly supervised by Professors Margareta Tengberg, who is with us here today as discussant, and Pascal Boutelon, together with George Wilcox, and focused on the emergence of agriculture at two pre-pottery Neolithic sites in Syria, namely Jadad el-Mughara and Tel Aswad. Since 2018, she has taken part in several archaeological excavations in northern and southern Iraq, where she works on the processing and analysis of archaeobotanical remains. Drawing on the large datasets produced through this fieldwork, she began a Marie Curie Fellowship in 2022 at the School of Archaeology, where she worked with Professor M. Charles. Her project, Do Grains Make the Difference?, examined and compared plant economies in Mesopotamia from the late Neolithic through to the Bronze Age. More recently, she and Professor Charles received support from the John Fell Fund for a project titled Farming Systems in Lowland Mesopotamia as a Foundation for Early Urban Societies. This research focuses on sites in southern Iraq with a particular emphasis on stable isotope analysis. Let us warmly welcome Dr. Carolyne Douché to share her paper. Thank you.
So, hello everyone. First, I'd like to thank the organizer for inviting me to present a part of my research that focuses on archaeobotanical and ethnobotanical study of sesame in Iraq. Before starting, I would like to say that I'm not a specialist of sesame. I just happen to identify some seed on archaeobotanical sites. So first, what is sesame? So it's an herbaceous annual plant that is predominantly self-pollinating. It belongs to the Pedaliaceae family and is represented by approximately 20 species, among which the wild species Sesamum malabricum present higher phylogenetic similarities with the domesticated Sesamum indicum, suggesting it may represent the wild progenitor. But there is a debate about the potential existence of an African wild progenitor, given the high diversity of wild population in this area, especially Eastern Africa and especially Ethiopia. So the plant is well adapted to warm climate and grows primarily in tropical and subtropical areas. As you all know, I guess, the crop is exploited for its seeds that are rich in oil and also in protein. In terms of anatomy, the fruit is a loculicidal capsule. So it opens into two valves, each divided into locule, usually two, but in some cases there are three. And they contain aligned packed seeds, as you can see on the slide, separated by a false septum. The seed is composed by two cotyledons and a radicle that germinates, wrapped into a seed coat that might be of different color from beige to brown or black, as you can see here. Archaeobotanically speaking, most of the earliest discoveries come from the Indian Peninsula. While a possible starch grain of wild sesame was found on a tool at Bagor, so dated around 5000, 4000 BC, this identification remained very uncertain. Other evidence are dated around the mid-3rd millennium, and then during the 2nd and 1st millennium, it appears more widespread, at least westward, although I ignore European and historical finds here. Additionally, it's not shown on this map, but recent research in East Asian archaeology, and especially China, have enabled the recovery of large amount of seed, often well preserved because they are often waterlogged, and they appear in the area around the 7th or 8th century AD onwards. But today I'd like to present data from Iraq that also evidence early use of sesame. Looking at the current landscape in lowland Iraq, you may think that we are far from a tropical region. So what do we know about sesame in ancient Iraq? The first source of evidence comes from cuneiform texts. I'm not going to talk a lot about it because Walther Sallaberger will, but I just want to mention that for the 3rd and 2nd millennium, first in the south and then further north, various documents report sesame, its cultivation, transport, and storage, various consumption forms, including the raw seeds and oil, various qualities and purpose, from food to medicine. For a long time, these textual sources were the only evidence for the presence and consumption of sesame in Iraq. But what about direct archaeobotanical evidence? Looking at old, so prior 2010s archaeobotanical data in Iraq, despite the 66 sites that yield plant remain, all period included, from the PPNA to the early Islamic period, you can see that data are quite uneven. Some periods are represented by more sites, but this doesn't mean that more plant remains were found. Overall, you can see on the graph, the number of plants per site is quite low, mainly due to the lack of systematic sampling strategy prior around 2010s. And among all these sites, only one site yielded sesame, the site of Abu Sallaberger. Thanks to large-scale and intensive sampling strategy implemented by Mike Charles in the 80s, small seeded and fragile taxa were recovered, and sesame was identified for the first time. The seeds come from residential areas, illustrated by the plan on the right, showing finds in different rooms and dated to the mid-3rd millennium. I recently analyzed the material from the previous occupation of the site, so dated to the mid-4th millennium, and despite the good preservation of the plant remains, I didn't find sesame seeds, confirming its introduction later during the early dynastic period. But apart from Abu Sallaberger, the resumption of fieldwork in Iraq offers new opportunities to investigate sesame, because most of new projects includes systematic sampling and flotation. Today, I'm presenting my own recent data from ongoing work. And as far as I know, there is no other find of sesame in Iraq. But if you're aware of any new data, I would be very pleased to hear that. As a disclaimer, unlike other crops, for sesame, we are not talking about large amount of seeds, but mainly present substance, often a very few charred remain. The reason is because, as most of oil-bearing taxa, the exposure to fire considerably damaged the seeds. The new sites shown on this map are located in different environmental conditions, from dryland, lowland to rainy mountain. Dates span from the 3rd to the 1st millennium. And so far, sesame was only found on urban sites of various sizes, but still only urban sites. But this is likely a bias, as exploration of rural settlement is widely ignored. The first site is Girsu in the south, where I recovered 2 well-preserved sesame seeds last autumn. They come from a context associated with food production, so in area O, located on the photo, and perfectly contemporaneous to the find of Abu Sallaberger, so dated to the mid-3rd millennium BC, reinforcing its arrival in Iraq at this period. Fortunately, at Girsu, the use of sesame is also confirmed by text, reporting its cultivation, its harvest at the same time as today, its consumption by different class of the population, from workforce to divinities and also animals, and in various forms, including oil. The second site is Kunara in northern Iraq at the border with Iran. In this case, sesame seeds were identified on the floor of a small kitchen, so the small room here, associated with many aromatic plants. Again, the seeds appear well preserved, as you can see on this specimen, with the seed coat perfectly intact. Interestingly, radiocarbon date reveals they date from the end of the 3rd millennium, so around the 22nd century BC, evidencing its use in the north quite early, so at least earlier than previously thought. In this case, sesame may have been used for food or for medicine, combined with other aromatics. The third site is Larsa. Here, the earliest evidence of sesame are dated to the Eastern Larsa period, so the 19th century BC. The few seeds were recovered on the floor of 2 rooms belonging to the house of the prime minister of the capital city. Additionally, I found more seeds in later Old Babylonian occupation, so 18th century BC, but from secondary deposits, so large pits. As you can see, the seeds are not very well preserved, as the seed coat is mostly gone, revealing the smooth embryo, especially from specimen on the right. At Larsa, texts dealing with sesame were also found. Apparently, the production was at least partly exported to Babylon, further north, and there was insecurity due to weather conditions, but also war that was quite frequent in the area. Again, sesame was widely used by various classes of the population. The fourth site is Ur, where I identified sesame seed in 2 areas. Area 4, where a Neo-Babylonian building was identified, and areas B and L, where an old Babylonian house was found. Work on the context is ongoing, but the seed provide evidence for the exploitation of sesame during the 2nd and 1st millennium BC. Seeds are of various size, and like at Larsa, the testa is not very well preserved. Some seeds, like the one at the bottom, clearly evidence damage due to exposure to fire as they started to explode. As for Girsu and Larsa, archived from the Ur-III period, so end of the 3rd millennium, associated with the temple, report sesame, or more precisely, the ploughman of sesame. Finally, the last find comes from the north at Gire Gomel. In this case, the nicely preserved seed come from the Hellenistic occupation, mainly represented by large pits, likely for storage. So far, I only identify a single seed, but I only analyze a few samples, while many more samples need to be studied. So if we compare textual and archaeobotanical evidence, data are obviously uneven, but they also appear complementary, as some seeds were identified where no text was found, and conversely, well, mainly conversely. Text from Girsu report the use of bitumen to plaster floor and tool associated with the processing of sesame. And in the case of Larsa, seeds of sesame were found on the floor of what was called the bathroom, due to, as you can see on the photo, it's a bitumen plaster floor, and also the presence of a hole in the middle. No archaeological material was found associated in the room, but I find this discovery quite interesting. So overall, the new archaeobotanical evidence highlights the potential of the systematic sampling strategy for plant remains. Context information will be essential, but direct radiocarbon date on the sesame seed itself would be necessary to secure the dating and track its dispersal, as recently did for poppy, for example. As you've seen, archaeological seeds exhibit different preservation states that could result from charring, but potentially also from processing. Unfortunately, the present data are too scarce to investigate this further, but we can investigate the use of sesame nowadays in Iraq. So sesame is widely consumed in Iraq in the form of raw seed or transformed into oil or paste. Here is a map showing present-day cultivation by region. The darker is the color of the governorate, the more extensive are surfaces devoted to the exploitation of sesame. As you can see, sesame is widely cultivated, except in the northeast and also south. In October 23, I had the opportunity to visit the city of Amedi, here on the promontory in Iraqi Kurdistan, located 17 kilometers from the Turkish border. So the city is famous for its traditional production of tahini, the sesame paste. So I went to see how the process looked like. The area is mountainous, you can see. The site lies at an altitude of approximately 1,200 meters and receives around 900 millimeters per year. And this can be very well seen as on the photo, the landscape looks very green, while it's quite unusual for this period in Iraq. I arrived too late to see the plant growing in the field, but on the right photo, you see that sesame was cultivated nearby a mix of other summer crops, such as corn, millet, and sunflower. But overall, local farmers mainly cultivate wheat and barley, along tobacco and sesame. At Amedi, sesame fields are quite small, around 200 per 10 meter. The farmers told me they start to prepare the soil in May. They plow the field and broadcast the seed together with sand to make sure that the seed actually fall in the field. They don't do anything before July when they start to irrigate and remove the weeds by hand. And they repeat this weeding a month later. They usually don't add manure, but when they do, they use sheep dung, which is apparently the best one. Sesame is cultivated in the field for 2 years maximum, and after that, they move to another field. As I said, the fruit are capsules that open when dried, exhibiting the seed. Harvesting is made by uprooting the whole plant in September, October. But bear in mind that Amedi is located in the north of Iraq, so the farming calendar is slightly later than it is in the south. Uprooted sesame plants are placed in bundles, usually in the field, but sometimes on the roof, and let to dry for 10 days. The drying time also allows for unripe capsule to complete their maturity. To extract the seed, the bundles are gently beaten by hand, as you can see here the farmer is doing. Usually the plants are beaten twice because the upper and the lower valve of the capsule do not ripe evenly. So the first beaten session allows to collect the first half, and after waiting approximately 3 days, the second half is ready to be collected through another beating session. After that, you get the product, so the seed and the byproduct, including the empty capsule, well, at least hopefully, the stem, leaves, and some weeds. Most of the byproduct can easily be removed by hand because they are like large pieces, and they are usually burned, but a final cleaning by sieving is needed prior to the consumption of the seeds. The next step happened in the tiny factory. This one used local sesame mainly, but they also use seeds imported from Mosul, where there are more extensive fields because the landscape is much flatter. The first step is to leave the bag full of seed to soak in fresh water for 2 days. Then the seeds are roughly ground to break the seed coat, and they are placed in basin full of salted water. This process helps to separate the seed coat that sink to the bottom from the embryo that, as you can see on the bottom photo, floats on the surface. This allows to easily collect the old or the out seed, so the embryo, with a strainer. The seeds are then placed in a double oven to be dried and toasted. In the case of Amedi, they mainly use pine wood as fuel because this is what is growing locally. And seeds are then sieved mechanically to remove the last impurities. So you can see that sometimes the seeds aggregate and they are too burnt, so these too much burnt pieces are removed. The last step of the process consists in grinding the seeds in a Amedi channel, diverting water from the local river, bring water to a funnel, so it's like the top left photo on the slide. So this funnel is located on the roof of the factory, and the pressure activates the milestone. And then the seeds are poured into the center and ground. And they're ground into the tiny that you can see on the large photo. And the tiny is then ready to be consumed with, well, preferably warm bread and good tea. Here I report the process to make tiny, while cuneiform texts report the production of oil. In case you wonder how different are the process, they are very similar. In both cases, the seeds are ground, but to obtain the oil, you need to grind longer and traditional methods often add water to help the separation of the oil. However, as far as I know, in both cases, dehusking and toasting are absolutely optional. So to conclude, as we've seen, sesame has been used for a very long time in Iraq. Although not native from the area, it rapidly became a major crop, although archaeobotanical evidence remained limited. Exploration of traditional process, as presented for Amélie, provide information about the crop processing and the product and byproduct to be expected in archaeological assemblage. The different elements and their taxonomy may be used as a referential material. However, despite the presence of text, we need to continue intensive sampling and investigate further residential areas as well as rural settlements. Finally, I'd like to thank all the colleagues working on the field and willing to collect sample for me, and for local authorities who allow me to export the sample. Hopefully, we will get more sesame seeds. I also would like to take this opportunity to thank my Kurdish colleague and friend who accompanied me in this sesame adventure in Amélie. And my last acknowledgement go for you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Carolyne. That was amazing and a beautifully illustrated lecture. I'm sure we have a lot of questions, but let's save all of that to the end. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to our second speaker, Professor Walther Sallaberger. Professor Walther Sallaberger is an Assyriologist at the University of Munich in Germany. He works in cuneiform texts written in Sumerian and Akkadian, and more broadly in the history and culture of ancient Mesopotamia. He has published several editions of clay tablets from excavations in Syria and Iraq spanning different periods, and has written extensively on its religion, history, society, language, and literature. His research focuses on everyday life in early Mesopotamia, in particular during the early and middle Bronze Ages, as reflected in the large body of administrative documents that survive from these periods. In addition to his earlier work on reeds, pottery, and beer brewing, he has co-directed with Gregory Chambon of Paris a project titled Vegetable Oils and Animal Fats, Resources, Production, and Uses in Early Mesopotamia. Today, he will share some of the team's findings on sesame. Let us warmly welcome Professor Walther Sallaberger to share his paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was a good start to have the archaeobotanical side, because until recently there was basically nothing about sesame from the archaeobotanical side. In my presentation today, I will first present our French-German research project, and then give the short overview of the words for sesame, because I've seen that philologists are always asked to give their ideas about the words and the spread of the words and the relationships. Then comes the central the main point that sesame was hardly ever used for food, as a food, but mainly for anointing, which is absolutely clear from the evidence, but it's not generally known. And so I thought I should make this point and then talk about the introduction of sesame cultivation and its dissemination. And you will soon discover in the next 15-20 minutes that there is a discrepancy between the philological data and the two or three seeds from Abu Sallaberger and Girso. In the end, I will present how we reconstruct the oil milling process from the cuneiform texts that give the inventories of workshops. Our research project is on vegetable oils and animal fats. It's based on two research centers, one directed by Gregory Chambon in Paris and one by me in Munich, and our shared interest in administrative texts, in everyday texts, in numbers especially, led us to deal together and to combine our strengths. Gregory is more experienced in the Old Babylonian period, the Middle Bronze Age. I have more experience in the third millennium, the Early Bronze Age, and so it was good to combine these efforts. Some of our data we have developed within the research of the 3 years that are already over, but the monograph is not yet published, unfortunately. So some of the results you can find in our website called I3 Mesop Oil. You can find it easily. And there we tried to organize it in a way that both the specialists and the interested people might find what they might be interested in. Now here with all the archaeobotanists, you will perhaps only be interested in the olive and almond and sesame, not all the animal fats. Now, what is the data? The data is in the third millennium, the early Bronze Age, are mostly administrative texts. Administrative texts are lists that note precisely in quantity and quality the products or objects that are transferred from one person to another. So since this is administration, they are extremely careful in giving the correct numbers, quantities, the correct terms. And of course, the people that stand behind that were important for them in their time. We don't know, so we have to reconstruct where this is settled. Since from the third millennium, from many sides, thousands of these administrative texts are preserved, often one can have a very dense picture of aspects of not daily life, but aspects of administration that mattered in their world. In the Middle Bronze Age or the Old Babylonian period, there are still the large entities, now mostly the palaces, but there is now more a family-based economy where there's more legal documents, we have more letters. And in our project, it was quite nice because for the end of the third millennium, we have all the numbers and understand the relationships, how it works, and the dates of the seeding season and all these things. And for the Old Babylonian period, there are letters that give some anecdotal uh, uh, view on the aspects treated in they had to deal with it. The sources span the 26th to 17th century in both large periods. There is one period that has the best data situation for the third millennium. That's the Ur3 period with over 100,000 published tablets, and mainly from daily life, covering southern and middle Babylonia, whereas from the Old Babylonian period is especially the 18th century with the best data situation covering Babylonia, but also Upper Mesopotamia and Syria, especially the site of Mari. Now, these texts show the words for sesame, and I assume now that all the sesame we are talking about is the same sesame. And so this is the Sesamum indicum. In Sumerian, this was called Geshi. That's literally the tree with oil. And that's important because it looks like a small tree, 1 meter high or so. And it also, the purpose of this plant is it's for oil. It's for, I think. And also then the sesame oil is called tree oil. In the Akkadian, there's another word, shamashamu or shamshamu, a word which has no known etymology. And this is a difficulty. We don't know where it comes from. It might come from another language. But it must have been through Mesopotamia that it was passed on to other regions, and we can document that for the late Bronze Age, when we have the word sounding similarly like shamshamu in Ugaritic, Hurrian, Hittite, Mycenaean, Linear B, Sasama, and of course then Doric Greek, Sasamon, Sesamon, so on until the modern languages. So the importance of Mesopotamia for spreading the sesame cultivation is quite apparent, and I would have liked to find a reference for sesame in Elamite, the language spoken and written in ancient Iran, but there's only one uncertain reference and called Hidur, which does not fit into the picture. It would have been so nice to have a link, a geographical link also between India and Mesopotamia. So in the end, we cannot say what is the background of the word, but we can see the distribution after the Akkadian language. Now, in our project, we deal with vegetable oils and animal fats, and that might come as a surprise in a crop history group. What we always cite in the beginning to explain our topic is the verses from the Gilgamesh epic, where by drinking beer, eating bread, shaving, and anointing makes white man Enkidu a human man. To anoint oneself after bathing, that is how you become human at that time in the Old Babylonian period. Anointing as a daily practice is reflected in thousands of cuneiform texts. So every messenger station where people pass by, they are served a meal there, a beer and a bread, some fish perhaps, and some oil to anoint themselves after their bath. If you welcome a guest, they receive oil for anointing. So this exceptionally rich textual evidence stems mostly from administrative archives. That's why we can be so certain about the numbers and also can exclude the presence of sesame oil, as you will see soon in the earlier periods. We have all kinds of animal fats and vegetable oils in the texts, and we were interested in our project to reconstruct the chain operatoire from production to consumption, the management of oil in the urban centers. So I will not discuss this today, how they cultivated the sesame in the fields and these things. But I will concentrate on the next point, namely the chronology. So the historical dimension is something that we only realized in the progress of our project. That although we always know one tends to treat Mesopotamia as a coherent whole. And even if you call it early Mesopotamia, these are still 1,000 years, and there must be developments and differences. So one of the points where it was very clear is butter. Butter was made from cow sheep milk, goat milk, sheep milk in the Uruk period, but only from goat and cow in the late 3rd millennium. And the Old Babylonian butter was only made from cow milk. And with the whole evidence, always with all these archives, dealing with expenditures, and as I said, oil was given out to guests for anointing, then sesame oil only appears suddenly in the Sargonic period, the period of the dynasty of Sargon of Akkad. Some call it also the Akkadian Empire. So around 2300 to 2150. And then it remains and it becomes a dominant factor in the oil. And now we were interested in this change. And I acknowledge, Carolyne, that you have presented the Abu Sallaberger samples. And there are many possibilities to think how that might have happened. So some sesame might have been present in Mesopotamia, but it was not used in the same way as it was after the Sargonic period. So it's not so much only, I think, what I presented following about being present, but also to be used in a way. Okay. So what we know very well in the pre-Sargonic period, in the early Sargonic period, so that's the 24th century, until the rebellion against Remus, about 2270. There are several archives, and they deal with the corresponding expenditures, but sesame is not attested. Butter is the standard fat oil. And butter is also used for anointing, but only more in elite contexts. Later, in the classical Sagonic period, that's from late Naramsin onwards, it's from usually dated after the Great Rebellion against Naramsin after about 2240. Sesame is well attested all over Mesopotamia. So there's no, it's there everywhere suddenly. Until very recently, there was no textual coverage of the period in between. But among the tablets from the lootings in Iraq in the 1990s, there's a group of Middle Sagonic texts which date to the period in between 2280 to 2240. And these tablets now have the first references to Sesame. And the context of Sesame in these tablets is so interesting and decisive that I want to present it shortly. Now, what do we have? We have some texts like this one that Mooney, the steward at the storehouse, received something like 2,760 liters of sesame seeds. This is not from nothing. There must be a kind of cultivation behind to have this large amount of seeds. The sesame is also combined with a field name in another text, and this field name is known as a barley field. So the same fields were used for sesame. And in the same archive, and this is what I find so interesting, is that one has the earliest Mesopotamian archival references to Melucha, that is West India, and it's the with the boats coming there. This ties in nicely chronologically with the history of what is known, because Sargon of Akkad said that he moved ships from Melucha, that's the Indus Valley, and Magan, Oman Peninsula, and probably also the other side of the Gulf at the land of Akkad. And Rimush defeated a coalition of Iranian lands. And so in this case, the presence of Meluchan boats comes very nicely together with the royal deeds written down at exactly the same period by the same kings. Later kings do not write such campaigns anymore. There are more imports from Meluch, and I think in this group we should not talk about the Indus-type seals, the carnelian and the water buffalo, but what in this group might be more interesting that also the proso millets have been claimed to have been introduced from India to Mesopotamia. And the millet is especially important because it's a summer crop, as is the sesame, which is difficult for the Mesopotamian farmers who always deal with winter crops. And also they had to take care in the harvest because otherwise they would scatter the seeds, and therefore they had some experience with millets when they took over the sesame. Millets never became very popular in Mesopotamia. In this archive already, so it's only a few decades, nothing of sesame before, sesame present afterwards. You see this change. I have marked in yellow the standard oil that is used for anointing, that's lard. So 46% of those expenditures are lard, but already 44% of the expenditures are sesame. So as soon as it is there, it is quickly distributed. And of course, the context is the palace of the governor of the Akkadian king. So it's an elite context. They have the means to cultivate sesame in their land. And there's also the need for the oil because the anointing and the body care plays an important role. And by Adab is only one of 30 provinces, and this explains the quick dissemination in the level of the provinces' palaces. Okay. Then in the classical Sogonic texts, 2240 to 2180, sesame and soy sesame oil are tested everywhere, so to say. How large was the sesame cultivation in the War 3 period? We tried to estimate it. So there were some shipments from Karaha, that's the Diyala region, and from Susa. But in Babylonia itself, 7% of the field area were cultivated with sesame. And we have calculated that in Oma or in Girso, they produce something that in the province of Girso, they produced between 400 and 550 tons of sesame annually. I have compared the numbers of of the O3 period with modern Iraq, and it's interesting that it's not so far off from modern Iraq of 2019, what was produced on sesame in the O3 period. I skip that um, and want to point to another aspect that is interesting with the change in cultivation techniques. So when the sesame was still relatively new, it was very often dealt with by specialized sesame farmers. This was in the end of the third millennium. With a high differentiation of professions, there was a specialized sesame. In the Old Babylonian period, when everything was more concentrated on the family, then a farmer did everything, doing the barley field as well as the sesame on the same field. And the sesame harvest, this matches quite nicely. The terminology that we have in the text fits quite nicely the steps that are needed to prepare the sesame. Then my last slide, if I am allowed still, is the Mesopotamian technology of oil pressing. This was a puzzle for us because many modern analogies or analogies from other regions of the world would not fit the inventory of materials that is present in early Mesopotamia. But what is interesting is that there are 3 texts with an inventory of a sesame mill, oil mill, and they have the same objects listed, and they include both mills and mortars. And therefore, the process that can be reconstructed is that the kernels were crushed on these hand mills, and this is a technique Mesopotamians had known before from grinding flour. But after you grind sesame, of course, you cannot use it for flour anymore. And then it was pounded in mortars, and this pounding in mortars is also possible. It was also known because they pounded already spices or various kinds of spices, including onions, in mortars before. So both techniques were known in the country and had to be developed. In the third millennium, it was a female profession with a group of women working there. But in the Old Babylonian period, it became more probably. No, we have only found references to bale oil millers. I think my time is more than over, and so I better stop now, and I'm waiting for your questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Walther. That was a wonderfully rich lecture with a very compelling historical overview of sesame in early Mesopotamia. I would now like to introduce and invite our discussant, Professor Margareta Tengberg, who will respond to our speakers' papers. Professor Margareta Tengberg is an archaeobotanist at the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris. She is a specialist in the interactions between past societies and plants in Southwest Asia through her coordination of projects, including 2 French national ANR projects, and her participation in nearly 60 field missions in the Middle East and Central Asia. She has explored various themes concerning both plant paleoenvironments and the organization of subsistence economies, with a focus on the periods from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age. Alongside her strong commitment to teaching and research supervision, first at the Sorbonne and then at the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle, she has been involved in research management various levels, including director of the laboratory and member of the scientific councils of the museum. Professor Margareta, please.
So thank you very much for this presentation, and thank you very much for inviting me to be the discussant after these two absolutely fascinating papers. Great job. And I'm looking at Sesame, Mesopotamia Sesame from the east, because I'm worked in the regions where sesame comes from originally. And I just allow myself for a very, very small personal souvenir, because when I was doing my thesis and I participated in the first IWGP meeting, the important archaeobotany meeting in 1998, so that's quite a while ago. I just presented results from Miri Kalat in the Makran region of western Pakistan, and there was some sesame. And it was like a small sensation because it was a new find, and people were very interested. And especially I was so proud, being this young student, that Professor Sohari, Daniel Sohari, was very interested in this sesame, because he was revising his book on the beginning of domestication of crops, and it was a new attestation of sesame. So that was a very nice memory for me, and the memory linked to this special plant. So these two presentations, I have some specific questions. That's my role, of course, in this role as a discussant. And you brought out, both of you, a lot of very precise and new data, and it's really transform our image of sesame, these two sets of data that are complementary, and sees the things from different angles. And one thing that I found very, very interesting is the introduction and the chronology of the introduction. And we got some very precise data, very convincing, I would say, from Walther Sallaberger on the dating, with such precise mentions from Adab as the very earliest evidence, and also then the widespread, the spread of sesame in the late Sargonic period, and that's so really interesting. And Carolyne also mentioned a very nice perspective that I think is really something that has to be done, and that's the dating of individual sesame seeds. And I had a question first to Carolyne about the dating, because apparently there's a little bit of discrepancy linked to Abu Sallaberger. From when do these seeds date? Do you have precise information? These are the oldest, aren't they, that Mike Charles discovered during his thesis. So what would you say about that dating?
So they come from the early dynastic tree period. So it's like very much contemporaneous to what, well, more or less contemporaneous to what Walther suggested. So, well,
a little bit earlier.
A bit earlier, yeah.
Mid third millennium.
Mid third, yeah.
And when speaking about dating these seeds, and you took you indicated the example of poppy seeds, papaver, opium poppy. It's been a program conducted by Aurélie Sallaberger, where she and colleagues dated individual seeds, and they are more or less a little bit smaller even maybe than sesame seeds, but they are also, we are always in the category of small seeds. And what would be really interesting would be to take into account the finds of the Indus Valley. There are not so many, but it could be possible, and to settle the chronology of both sides in a way. And so what do you think about the diffusion ways? Walther mentioned the text from the Sargon area with boats that roamed in Akkad. Do you think by sea or by land or both, or what do you have some ideas about that? Both of you?
I guess Walther may have more precise information about it, because in my case it's very scarce information we have from the seeds, but from the text is more precise. Like it shows, like, as you said, like, well, the text mentioned the boat as far as I know, like the transport of seeds by boat. And it seems very convincing that it was imported. Now Walter cannot speak, I guess.
Yeah, now I
Ah, no, you
can.
can.
Yeah, I think I fully agree that the early seeds from Sallaberger are a problem, so to say. They were apparently it was there, the sesame, was there in material from dung. So perhaps not cultivated, we don't know. It might be in a different kind of sesame. They might have discovered only when they made the contact with the Meluchan people how to make something out of sesame. They brought the good sesame from Melucha to Mesopotamia. There are many possibilities one can play out, and I would really think it would be so great to have a more precise dating of the finds from, especially from the Indus Valley. Because what they present always, it's so vague, and one cannot work with that. So it might be that, as I said, it might be that it's not the introduction, but it starts. And then in the archives, mostly we don't have the cultivation, but mostly the expenditure of the product, the oil. Only in the O3 period. So sometimes there's a farmer brings sesame seeds, and then we know it's from the fields, which is good to know because one could always assume it's imported from somewhere else, and people argue like that. So it's good to know it's cultivated on the fields in the land. And only for the O3 period it's possible to calculate because they have this very careful registration of the land and who cultivates what and when and so. And with these long lists, it's possible to have an understanding of the global cultivation in this period. Yeah.
Mm.
And one can even give numbers. But yeah.
The problem from the east is that we have so little materials still. I mean, there's mention from Harappa, and I think it needs to be dated too. There's very few seeds from Mirikalat. It's Indus Valley late third millennium context, real true Harappan context. It's really, there's nothing in earlier levels where we have like a local Baluchi or Makran archaeology or context, but when we have sesame, when we have a Harappan occupation, so it seems to be very linked to that Indus Valley civilization that brought probably sesame in the late third millennium. This is a sort of one of the westernmost outposts of the Harappan civilization, and sesame is associated with that. And more recently, we have found sesame at Chanudaro in the Indus Valley, but it needs to be dated to a very small seed. And what you say, Walter, about growing wild in Sallaberger, that sounds very unlikely, I think, because there are no wild sesame species in Iraq, I think. But you mean it could have been introduced and then growing there?
As Caroline said in the beginning, there are various kinds of sesame, and so it might not be the Sesame Mindicum. I only it's that I'm at a loss to explain it in a clever way, because there must be some point where they understood that one can make it out of it, but the the earlier periods are also so well documented, and the need of anointing oil is so present everywhere. And you can make this very, very sharp cut between, yeah, anointing with butter and lard and then with sesame oil.
But it could have been used earlier for other purposes, no?
I would not be so optimistic because the textual documentation is so strong that that so if the administration provides um, the foodstuffs for a large festival, they have to write minutiously lists what is given there. And therefore we are very, very well informed about the ingredients that go into the various dishes at the time. And it's not that all the sesame oil was used for anointing. There's a tiny, tiny, tiny exception because for one sweet, they sometimes add a little bit of sesame oil to it. But for your Larsa evidence, I think that fits so nicely because if it's the bathroom, this is where you anoint yourself after the shower. Yeah, yeah, and of course, not always might have been such a good uh, milling that every seed might have disappeared.
But was that the sense of your presenting the so-called bathroom as a place where you would anoint, or was it, would you think was a place where you would produce oil, Carolyne? How did you see that?
Yeah, for me it was more, well, I'm not saying that this specific room was dedicated to the production of sesame, but I find it interesting that we call it the bathroom, and it, well, we don't have any other evidence, so it would be only speculation. But for me, it was like, okay, can it be a room for the production of oil because it was completely plastered with bitumen, so that's why they called it the bathroom, and we don't have it. I mean, we have a lot of reference to sesame oil production in Mesopotamia, but we don't have the facilities. There is the example of Ebla, for example, where they found the mortar, and there is a very nice example of Khmer Blur in the very north, where they apparently
Armenia.
found, yeah, where they apparently found so it's first millennium BC, but there was a whole workshop area with all the facilities, but we don't have this for Mesopotamia. So I think it would be nice at some point to find the further evidence for the processing, like archaeological evidence, in addition to texts. Yeah.
Suris, is there time for, can I ask one more question before we leave the word to the others, or, well, Walther also?
Interestingly, what we know about the oil production in the Old Babylonian period is that they rented out the tools that were needed for milling. And so they went around and used it there. So I would not, of course, there in the house of the Suckermach in Larsa, you would expect perhaps oil mill at his home. Surely, yeah, there it might be possible.
I have a very last question, and then we leave so the audience can ask some questions too before we end. And in fact, Walter, you spoke about in the early Bronze Age, the sesame was cultivated by special farmers, and then later in the Old Babylonian period, it seems to be more, I mean, mixed with other type of productions and farmers that cultivate other things. And I wonder, I mean, in the early Bronze Age, and when sesame is short after sesame was introduced in the late third millennium, or in the mid or late third millennium, that's the question. Is it ever like mentioned like a exotic crop or a prestigious crop? Has it got a special status in the text? Or also to Carolyne, from archaeological context, is there anything that indicates that it becomes like that it has a special status in the Mesopotamian society?
Perhaps in the first 20 years. And that it had a special status when it was only in the palaces, and then it was so widespread that everybody discovered how cheap it is to produce oil with sesame. It can be pressed, milled all the year. It's a high quality oil for anointing. So then it's very soon everywhere. At the end of the third millennium, it's in the monthly provisions of people and everybody who works. For example, the women working in the textile workshops, they are, so to say, the bottom of the social ladder. They receive their rations of grain and wool or a garment and oil for anointing. And so, and it was enough to have a bath every 3 times, 5 times a month. So not so bad. So this was the lowest class people who received it, but it spread extremely fast and everywhere. And then it was so self-evident that the sesame oil is the oil that it was practically synonymous, the word.
So perhaps probably
But of
even.
course,
Hmm?
but I'm very sorry to say that understanding now the milling and that oil was used for anointing and not for decorating cakes or baking, it makes your life as your botanist much harder because if they had worked carefully, most of the sesame seeds were simply gone.
So in the early Bronze Age, or even in the in the Old Babylonian period, could have been considered as a common crop. I mean, even not
Yeah,
many
also,
people
also in Europe.
wouldn't even think it came from elsewhere than Mesopotamia. Completely naturalized, probably.
Yeah.
It was already in the Zagonic and in the Othic period. There's never the impression that this is something special.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What makes an anointing? So it's always good to see in the context. And here the context is the oils for anointing, and the most precious and most estimated oils for anointing are those that are perfumed. There you add the perfumes of pine and cypress and cedars and of all the trees. And the more perfumed an oil is, the higher the value is. And there's clearly a differentiation. And almond oil is the most expensive one. But yeah, no, sesame is really has been accepted as Mesopotamian very soon, as far as we can see.
But in terms
Thank
of
you, everyone.
archaeobotanical finds, it would be, that's why I also mentioned that it would also be nice to have samples from different contexts, because so far we have only, well, mainly excavation from large urban settlements. So in order to see how different was the consumption according to the social class, for example, or to the type of settlement, it would be good to be able to compare these different settlements. But for now, we only have monumental building excavated, so not much household.
Thank you, everyone. That was a wonderful discussion. We're now going to open it to the wider group. So please feel free to drop your questions in the chat box. But we can, of course, continue our discussion here while the questions are coming through. We are slightly under 12 minutes, so we still have time for this. So if I may add, there's one more piece of evidence with regards to the route of introduction, but it's kind of tangential. The Indus black slipped jars from the Persian Gulf, from those that were analyzed from the UAE, were thought to contain a vegetal oil. It's been hypothesized that it might either be sesame or less likely flaxseed. Flaxseed is less likely because it's subject to deterioration faster than sesame. Part of sesame's appeal is that it keeps much longer than other kinds of vegetal oils as well.
I don't know. Oh, yes, a question. Yeah, you can see that. Suresh, can you read it?
Yes. So this is a question to Walther. Referring to the table in slide 9, how do you explain the lack of textual information on olive oil in Mesopotamia? It is quite surprising to me considering its importance and trading in the Bronze Age period. So this is a question from Oz Barazani.
Okay. Olive oil is a very interesting aspect. The slide was shown an overview of fats and oils in lowland Mesopotamia. Yeah. So this is clearly the region where olive was never cultivated. Olive was cultivated in the Levant, and there it's already attested in the third millennium in Ebla very well, and this is well known and does not. And then it was imported, of course, to Mari, both in the third millennium and in the Old Babylonian period. But interestingly, olive oil was never very much sent to Babylonia. Only at Gudea, the famous Gudea of Lagash, with the statues in the Louvre, he at his palace there are some references for olive oil. So in our texts we know something like a handful of pots with olive oil that arrived in Mesopotamia because Gudea had so good diplomatic relations even to the west, whereas the Ur-3 Empire only had diplomatic relations to the east and not to the west anymore. But in the Ur-3 period, there are exotic gardens. And these are, so to say, the places where one tests out innovations. And in the Ur-3 period, especially in the royal realm, they were very creative to test out different kinds of animal breeding and of plants. And in these reports of the gardens, they even note the age of the trees. So for no person do they ever note the age, but for the trees, they note a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year old trees. And there they tried, no, they had also olive trees in the gardens in Sumer in the Ur-3 period, but evidently that was not a successful experiment. But it's good also to see the failing experiments, what they tried out in botanical and agricultural innovation, especially under the royal patronage.
Thank you, Walter. We have another question for you from Tanya Valamoti. So her question is, as regards to possible words that refer to oil plants and oil from a plant other than sesame, in 3rd millennium BCE Greece, we find Lalimantia, a plant that is not native to Europe, so definitely introduced, possibly from Central Asia via routes connecting the Aegean and Southeast Europe to the east. It would be interesting to see if oil plants besides sesame were grown and used for their oil.
It would be, I didn't get it last, Praise. It would be nice to know.
So it doesn't end with a question. It's more of a remark here. It'd be interesting to see if oil plants besides sesame are grown and used for their oil. I'm not sure if this is referring to a Middle Eastern or more Mediterranean context here.
Yeah, the only other oil plant, besides, of course, the olive in the west, in the Levant, and then we have the almond in the Zagros Mountains, and you don't need the cultivated almond, the domesticated almond, because it's used for anointing, and so the bitter taste doesn't play a role. And then there is also, I have opened it here, safflower oil. That's quite nice. It's in the Old Babylonian period in the northern Upper Mesopotamia. And there is one word that was not identified, and it is exactly in the same region where the paleobotanists have identified that safflower was used. And so this is a very, very nice coincidence of the region of the text and of the plant.
So she did have a follow-up on an unidentified word, and I think you answered that as well. So thank you. And if I may interject here, Herodotus makes the comment in the 1st millennium that the Babylonians don't use any other oil except that of sesame. He says this in Book 1. What do we make of that? Is that true in a 1st millennium BCE context in Mesopotamia?
It's clearly their standard oil. Yeah. 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 Yes,
Okay.
it's all these things. If you see they only use that, it doesn't mean that other oils don't exist, but it's the predominant oil. Yeah.
Okay, so Daniel has a question for us. How likely is it that sesame's historical diffusion within Mesopotamia during the first 3 millennia BCE spread northwest along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers? This seems to be supported by one of Carolyne's slides of the archaeobotanical evidence, but maybe this is an illusion, especially if the texts indicate rapid adoption.
Yeah, I guess you're referring to the evidence from Kunara, where I found several sesame seeds from the site, and we did radiocarbon dating, but not on the sesame seed because I didn't thought it would work. So we did from another cereal grain from the same assemblage, and it shows 22nd century BC. But how was it spread there? Well, so far that the earliest evidence we have, archaeobotanical evidence we have for now for the spread toward the north. So yeah, I guess it's as Walther said, like, yes, there was a rapid as soon as it reached Mesopotamia, it was rapidly adopted by Mesopotamian society. So that's why we find it quite quickly in the north. But it means very quickly then if we follow Walther.
Yeah, this was also one of the surprises of this research. But it's not that these products or these plants move and spread naturally, but they move in their social context. And this highest class of the governors of the empire, they are in a constant exchange. And so if they have the sesame oil, we also have to have it. And then in the 30 provinces, it's there within few years everywhere.
I think maybe this is something that future scholarship has to resolve. Are we dealing with repeated introductions or a single decisive introduction, as the text seemed to suggest? And there's that discrepancy that we spoke about earlier with the early dynastic three syllabic sesame seeds and the Sargonic introduction that seems very clear from the textual point of view. So we have
Yeah,
time
but
for
for this, I also want to add, like, my recent find that Girsu make it quite contemporaneous because it's well, we didn't get radiocarbon date from this context yet, but it's supposed to be early dynastic tree too. Well, although it's only two seeds so far, so I need to work more on the new sample, but it would attest it again from very contemporaneous period as Abu Salabi. So yeah.
But maybe to interfere in the dating, because there could be, I mean, early dynastic links to the Indus Valley or earlier than the Sargonic texts that speak about sesame, or Adab texts that mention sesame explicitly. That's a possibility.
So we have one final follow-up question from Daniel, and I think I'll have that as the final question for us. Regarding the Abu Salabic archaeobotanical evidence apparently predating the text, is it possible that sesame was initially adopted for consumption and cultivation by peasants and only later adopted by elites for anointing oil?
Yeah, you can. Of course, you can invent such stories.
But from an archaeological point of view, like,
how to prove that? How to prove that?
I mean, do we have any evidence from an archaeological point of view of sesame being used for cooking? Maybe Carolyne could pick up on that, like.
No, I mean, you can always do hypothesis, but there is no clear evidence. But it's possible that the seed were used for other purpose, like before being used for oil. But Walther doesn't seem to be very convinced by it.
Yeah, it's because the evidence is so strong, and if you assume that there was a food, a dish that is not attested in the texts, you have to have really very good arguments because it's not a text here and a text there, and that could somewhere in between have been left out. No, we have quite complete lists of that what people consumed at that time. And therefore, if something is not present, it has to be taken seriously. And of course, we don't know in this case clearly, and Daniel is completely right. It's outside of the world of the text, outside of the sunlight of the text. But what then was the point? I think it will be extremely difficult to prove this. And what I still find puzzling is the correlation of the introduction of sesame with India. So there is something in this Indian adventure that is linked to the distribution of sesame, although there are sesame seeds before. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, everybody. We are running out of time, so I think I will close the session now. Thank you, everyone, for your questions, and many thanks to our speakers and discussant for your time and expertise. We would also like to thank all the individuals who have worked behind the scenes to make this series possible, including Professor Michelle Alexander, Dr. Daniel Fuchs, Dr. Vladimir Dabrowski, Dr. Raquel Piarini, Ms. Raya Evan-David, and Mr. Ido Gilad. Our next webinar session will be focused on flax and its textile byproduct, namely linen. This will be taking place online at 3 p.m. Central European Time on the 12th of March. Everyone is welcome. We aim to hold talks like these once every 6 weeks, each time about a different crop, and we invite scholars to offer themselves as speakers by contacting Ms. Raya Evan-David, the Crop History Consortium's project manager, through email. So the email is chc.seminars@gmail.com. I repeat, chc.seminars@gmail.com. So please do spread the word. Thank you once again for your attention. Goodbye.